Kwan le Ras HA-SHANAH bedechna adaresa wu pesalamta salamtana taina yisterling. Greetings. This is September 9th, 2010, and we'd like to greet one and all in the name of the King of Kings and His Christ, and say happy Rastafari Ras HA-SHANAH, or as most people probably would say, or as they're familiar with, erroneously, but somewhat familiar with, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh HA-SHANAH. But what does Rosh Hashanah mean? This is the so-called Hebrew New Year. Well, this is one of the Hebrew New Years, actually the civil New Year, because the qedus or Kodesh New Year, the Holy New Year, actually begins around the April-May time of the year, around the whole feast and festival of Fasika and the coming out, when the Exodus occurred, when our people were persecuted by the Amalekites and the Edomites, who were Egyptianized in Egypt, not by the native Egyptians. Many of them are our brothers and family members. And this is part of the half of the story that hasn't been told, about the connection between the Hebrews and Kemet, as well as another portion in the half of the story that hasn't been told, which is also linked to this, is the connection between the Hebrews and the native Egyptians, or the Kamites, and the ancient Ethiopians, who are sometimes called the Cushites, but we have many different descendants who all come from that common ancestor that biblically we know as the Adam, or a little more tighten up on the story of the genealogy and the table of nations from Noah. But see, the whole thing with Noah, we've touched on that as well, which is a whole other topic matter concerning the table of nations and the racist misinterpretation of the table of nations that many of our so-called Hebrew Israelites and black folks who get into the Bible and recognize their Hebrew identity, a lot of things that they initially digest, and the Hebraic or so-called Jewish food they digest is made and prepared by the Jews who say they are Jews. You understand? So we should be a little bit cautious of that, even though some of them may be credited for doing justice to the best of their ability to preserving some of our antiquity, those strangers amongst us, the strangers who rose up when we went astray. And this is also touched on within our sabbatical teachings over the last couple of weeks, because now we have entered into, and we're entering into the 53rd Sabbath. And the 53rd Sabbath actually coincides, very interestingly enough, in this particular space and time that we're in these latter days, it coincides with the Ethiopian New Year. So some would say, well, you said Rosh Hashanah. I said, yes, Rosh Hashanah, but more correctly, it's Ras HA-SHANAH, or Ras HA-SHANAH, or Ras HA-SHANAH, if you please. And Ras and Rosh is one and the same. So when you see that word Rosh, you understand, within the Hebrew, recognize that word Rosh is actually the Ethiopic word Ras, or the Amharic word Ras. So Ras means head, it also means self. And there's a very interesting teaching on this, because the very first word of the book that we know as the book of Genesis is called Bereket. Some say Berashet, some say Berashit, you understand? But it's really Beras, in the head, Berasit. The very first word of Genesis is in the Ras. That's the very first word. Now, the English established version, the King James Version, as many of us know, translates this key Hebraic word as in the beginning. But this rendering of it is disputed by many, many scholars and many who have studied, and even we dispute this particular translation where it says in the beginning. But when you start to really do due diligence to studying the Ethiopic and the ancient Shemitic code and keys in order to understand the biblical Hebrew, you begin to recognize that Berasit, or Berashit, or Berashet really means be'aras, in the head. Now, to Tertullian, one of the early Christian generation scholars, he approved of in power. Grotius, he translated it when first. But now, the authors of the Targum of Jerusalem, or what's called the Targum and Targum. The Jews say Targum. We, as the Ethiopics, we say Targum. But the Targum means translation. Now, the original Targum of Jerusalem, and those should have known the language that they were speaking and known the biblical Hebrew, if anyone at that particular time did. Very interestingly enough, they translated as in wisdom. In other words, Berasit, in the head, was translated as in wisdom. Now, Godfrey Higgins, in his very interesting book called Anacalypsis, he insists on Berasit being the sign of the ablative core case, meaning in, and ras or rasit, an ancient word for hokmah. He said that this was an ancient, that ras, the male, and rasit, the female archaic female form, because of the te or the tau that's put at the end of the word, was actually an ancient word for hokmah, or wisdom. So when we speak about the Rastafari, and we say to you all, happy Rastafari, Ras HA-SHANAH, the head of the year, is significant, and the link with the so-called Jewish New Year and the Ethiopian New Year is very important. Many have noticed that there's a link, but many have not really investigated or really gone to the foundation to see, well, what is the true biblical and ancient link between the so-called Jewish New Year, which we're actually in right now. This is why we decided to begin this off early, because there's 3 days between today. Actually, yesterday was the sighting of the moon, because the so-called Jewish calendar, the ancient Hebraic calendar, is a lunar calendar. Our Ethiopic calendar is primarily a solar calendar. So this relation between the solar and the lunar is biblical, is ancient. In fact, the original peoples recognize this alignment between the solar as well as the lunar, and even basic science will tell you there's a link between the sun and the moon. So the ancient people, and this has nothing to do with the so-called idolatrous practices that in ignorance came about way after the most ancient ones who we read about in the scripture, who were told that the signs for signs, seasons, and days and years, this is the reason why the sun, the moon, and the stars was there. And when we look through Genesis, we also see links with Joseph, where Joseph spoke about the 12th planet and the 12 planets, which is also a connection that many have not really fully investigated. So once again, happy Rastafari and happy Hebraic and Hebrew Ras HA-SHANAH, Ras HA-SHANAH, the head of the Sana, or the head of the year. But we have to observe these 3 days this year. This is what's interesting. There's a 3-day period between the 9th of September, where we're at right now, and the 11th of September. Now here's the question. What's up with this? You understand? What about this? Is there something more that they have missed, but something that we should not miss if we faithfully utilize the keys given to us by our Christina Abbat, by Kedamawi Haile Selassie? And this key is the Metaf Qedus and the teachings of His Imperial Majesty. So, happy Ras HA-SHANAH to one and all, as we are entering into a very, very important cycle of the year. And we're going to begin off by touching on the Sabbath reading, because it's very important for us to understand that this is even though it's the civil New Year, you understand, the civil New Year for the Jews and the Jewish, but there's a link with our holy Ethiopic New Year coming up in the next 3 days. And Scripture points to this 3-day period. We tried to touch on it in an earlier posting where we spoke about this 3-day period. And this particular year is a classic example of what we were referring to when we mentioned the particular 3-day period, which is very biblical. It's very biblical. It's very scriptural. It's very, very foundational. So we have to understand the importance of time. Because if we're to redeem the time, we have to understand, well, what time are we in? And when the Bible speaks about the signs of the time, how can we decipher the signs of the time if we don't know what time it is? And that Rolex or that watch or whatever kind can be blinged out ain't going to tell you the right time. Only the truth of the King of Kings and His Christ